Hi and welcome to my video diary for advanced modeling in the games engine. In this video I will discuss different workflows and approaches to creating characters for games. I will also explain any problems which have arisen during development and creation of my character. Then I shall explain the engine setup, including the composition of the final render using 3-point lighting and matinee. Finally, moving on to an evaluation and a comparison with another student's work. When designing this model, I had to consider the epic rig as the character was going to use the default animations. I began to model around the male skeleton. As my character was mainly basic primitives, there was no need to polymodel the character, as suggested in Mastering Unreal Technology, although polymodeling was done to create the custom parts. This is where my workflow starts to differ from that suggested on the UDM website. Instead of unwrapping and texturing, I skinned the character so I was able to test him in engine. My first test wasn't successful due to the weighting the entire torso to the hips. This provided some strange results. The idea behind fully weighting the torso to one bone was so that the torso remained rigid as it was made of wood. In practice this didn't work, so the mesh was re-weighted, but this time the weighting was spread between all spine bones. This allowed the animation to play through as desired. Once the character was weighted correctly, it was unwrapped according to the UV layout specified by the engine. The texture was then hand-painted in Photoshop. To achieve greater detail in the diffuse texture, photographic reference was used as an overlay layer, then highlights and shadows were added. For normal map creation, there are several options. The Unreal workflow uses a program such as ZBrush to create a high poly model, which in turn is used to create the normal map via a tool such as Render to Texture. For my character, I used an NVIDIA Normals filter available in Photoshop. This approach was taken due to the diffuse texture containing a lot of details, which may not have been possible to capture if the normals were created in a separate program, although ZBrush may have been used to add variation to the model through the alphas. Once a full texture set has been made for both the head and body, they were assigned to the mesh in Max. The mesh was then exported to the PSK via Actor X, ready for importing into the Unreal Engine. Once all the mesh segments and materials have been imported into the editor, the meshes need to be moved -51 on the Z axis and -19 on the Y axis. In order to assign textures to the meshes, they need to be applied to a material. In this case, we use the material instant constant. A material instant constant works on a parent-child system and allows you to keep or use certain texture properties and use your own texture sheets instead. For this model, the properties of the Iron Guard male were used, mainly for the emissive aspect as the eyes of the character glow. The next stage involved is placing sockets on the torso, boots and arms, so that objects such as guns, jump boots and neck stumps would appear in game. At this stage, a simple ini file was written to test the character in game. A problem which arose was that although the textures were showing up fine in the character select screen, in-game the thighs were appearing black. This was due to the material IDs not being set to 1 in Max. So back in Max, all material IDs were set to 1, then re-exported and imported. Due to having the same names and replacing the previous meshes, no sockets, positions or rotations needed to be updated. When I had the character functioning correctly, I then focused on getting custom parts into the character select screen. This was achieved simply by adding some ini files and adding the meshes themselves into the package. Separate packages were made for the FPS arms and physics assets. The physics asset is created by scaling and moving collision boxes in the Unreal Fat editor. During testing of my character, a member of the Epic forum, Sephora, mentioned that when he feigned death on some occasions he would die. He suggested this could be due to the collision boxes being too close together. After looking at and changing the sizes of some of the collision boxes on the torso, the problem seems to be fine. In order to get the FPS arms and custom physics into game, along with a custom faction, a family needed to be created. This was done by writing a script and compiling it through Unreal Front-End. A common error while compiling was that Front-End couldn't find the physics package. To solve this problem, the physics package needed to be placed in the published custom car folder. To finish the engine setup and get the character ready for distribution, a separate ini file was written, with which the engine could add to the custom car ini in the config. The packages were then cooked to reduce their file sizes and make downloading them easier. A .execute file was made to make installing the character much easier. Right, here we have the custom faction picture with the custom name, the character select screen, and when this model loads up we will be able to see the different customizable parts. So we've got the helmet, and then also a pair of goggles. In the final composition of my model, I have used the 3-point lighting technique. This is achieved by having 3 lights. A key light, which is the main illuminating light, a fill light, this gets rid of any harsh shadows, and a rim light. This is positioned behind the character to make it visually separate to the background. I've been using 3D renderers Jeremy Bryan as a guideline. I implemented this into the Unreal editor. This is the key light, the fill light, and then the back rim light. Next, I use the Matinee and Kismet to animate both the pedestal and character 360 degrees, like so. Seeing as the character was created for games, although it must look good, it must also be able to animate as well. So a simple animation was added to the character to demonstrate this, and implemented using a skeletal group in the Matinee. I experimented having the character spin and animate, but the turntable then became too busy, so I opted to have the pedestal still while the character animates. To add to this composition, I could experiment with colours in the lights, adding in colours which complemented the character, mainly greens and blues according to the colour wheel. This could help the character separate from the background and add a bit more life into the scene. Overall, I am extremely happy with what I have produced, and although the model may not be the most complicated, but the complexity of the engine setup makes up for it. Feedback from the Epic forum and people's general remarks have allowed the model and textures and implementation to improve and go from strength to strength. If I was to redo this model, I would like to create my own material instant, as the opacity map for one of the customizable parts doesn't show in game. Experimenting with cloth so that chains would animate according to the movement of the Epic rig as well. When I compare my workflow to another student's, the main differences are with the rigging/unwrap stage. In Pat's workflow, the high poly normal map creation had to come first due to the change in topology caused by sculpting. I think I would have used this approach if my character was destined for ZBrush, as a new low poly model would need to be created to accommodate the normal map. As mentioned before, the major disadvantage of using this approach is that the testing in engine doesn't come till late, and normal maps may be needed to and normal maps may be needed to remake if the geometry doesn't deform correctly.